Good morning. My name is Jim Johnson, Chair of the Danforth Leadership Council, and I'd like to welcome all of our guests to the center. We've got a wonderful crowd here. I'm just curious, could those who are kind of new to the center please raise their hand? Including our new president, thank you. Today's event, the second annual Seeds of Change, is presented to you by the Danforth Leadership Council, a group of 60 community leaders dedicated to being part of the solution for St. Louis, and of the belief that supporting the mission of the Danforth Center, particularly its goal to have St. Louis become the World Center for Plant Science, will strengthen St. Louis and the greater region. To paraphrase our speaker today, these Midwesterners get it. They get the fact that in this new economy, there are going to be winners and losers, and the winners will be the ones leveraging any strength at hand. With Seeds of Change, we want to give engaged people living in the region an opportunity to connect with others who think passionately about our community. This is one of the reasons that we assembled a panel of individuals who know a lot about the importance of local economic development and the potential for plant science to lead it, to join Richard Longworth on the stage following his remarks. So a note about the Q&A. When you entered, you got a card, and on that card on one side you had the full bios of all the presenters to save time, and on the back, on the reverse side, there's a place to jot your questions. To ensure we have a representation of questions, all questions should be written out legibly and submitted to an usher. They will only be accepted until 8:30 a.m., after which no more written questions will be submitted. There are some microphones you'll see on both sides if we have time for a few additional questions. Following the last question, our new center president, Jim Carrington, will have some closing remarks to share. With that, I'd like to welcome author and senior fellow of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, Richard Longworth, our Seeds of Change presenter.
Jim, thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for coming out on this hot morning. It's a very impressive crowd. It's really a pleasure for me to be back here at the Danforth Center. An honor. The center, as you all know, everybody in St. Louis is very much aware, is one of the most impressive institutions, scientific or civic, in the Midwest. And I'm honored also to be joined by this very distinguished panel today, and I hope we'll strike some sparks, not only ideas about St. Louis, but about this place where we all live and work, make our lives, called the Midwest. Tell the truth, I snuck into St. Louis with a little bit of trepidation. If you've seen my book, you know that I had a few not very flattering things to say about your town, but please don't take it personally. I find that almost everywhere I go in the Midwest, I run into somebody whose hometown I've insulted. So far, nobody's taken a swing at me. I was really glad to see the sign outside to say you maintain a weapons-free zone here. Some people even concede that their hometowns may have deserved those insults. I'll try to be kind today, but I don't promise to succeed. If I was a little rough on St. Louis, I think I made up for it with a good deal of praise for the Danforth Center, which I called one of St. Louis's enviable assets, and for Roger Beachy, along with Monsanto, Washington University, and other building blocks of a bioscience future. As I recall, I wrote that, as I quote, "St. Louis has a lot going for it, and it may be better than it looks." Now, I admit this is kind of faint praise. But my aim here today is to talk about both your town and the broader Midwest, and in the Midwest these days, praise of any sort is pretty rare. The fact is that most of our Midwest does have problems and isn't doing a very good job of solving them. These are long-running, systemic problems, not something served up by the recession, not something that's going to go away very quick. I wrote the book before the recession began. All the problems and challenges I described existed before the recession hit, and if we don't do something about them, they're going to be here long after the recession ends. Now, a lot of this, I'm afraid, tends to be a little gloomy. I ran into a professor down in Indianapolis, and he says, read your book, he said. Got a lot out of it, but it sure helped to have a bottle of scotch sitting next to me while I was reading it. I think it's a little early in the morning probably to bring out the scotch, but there is some good news out there too. Basically, I discovered that I only said out loud what a lot of other people were already thinking. Many Midwesterners have made the mental leap, have recognized that the industrial era is pretty much over and the age of globalization is here, that the old ways really won't work anymore, that we've got to recover and retool and reinvent. These people are thinking hard and working hard. Some of them are right here in St. Louis. I think probably quite a lot of them are right here in this room. There are a lot of good ideas popping up, and I'll be talking about those this morning. But first, let me describe what I found in putting some 55,000 miles on the speedometer driving around the Midwest. The beauty of reporting on the Midwest is that you don't have to go through O'Hare to do it. But what I discovered was a region that once was the real economic powerhouse of the nation, indeed maybe the economic powerhouse of the world, and now too often lies on the wrong side of the American tracks. This is true of the entire region, from western Pennsylvania through Ohio and Indiana, through Illinois and Indiana and into Missouri, from Michigan into Minnesota. This is a region that does two big things for a living, which are heavy industry and intensive agriculture, and globalization has come along and tossed both of them right up in the air. So we've got a regional problem here, not just a St. Louis problem or a Missouri problem, but a regional problem. And if we solve it, it's going to be as a region. Now, I'll be coming back to this point later to put this into a regional focus. But the main fact is that globalization is literally transforming this very important part of our American nation. Now, I want to say right away that you're not going to get any anti-globalization tirade from me today. Globalization is here, and it's not going to go away. We can't raise the drawbridge. Globalization is the present and it's the future, and saying it's bad or good is like saying the last big economic wave, which was the industrial era, was bad or good. Well, it was bad for some people and it was good for others, and once we got it figured out, it was really good for the Midwest. Hard to remember now, but we were the Silicon Valley of the industrial age. All those good ideas and inventions that powered the American economy, all those backyard tinkerers and basement entrepreneurs, they were all Midwesterners, and what they created made us rich. That era created Midwestern industry, and Midwestern farming, and Midwestern cities, and Midwestern railroads, and Midwestern education. For all its raw power and labor battles and pollution, the industrial age was very, very good for the Midwest. And now it's over. The age of globalization is here, and if you think the industrial age changed the way we live, you haven't seen anything yet. We have new challenges from places and people that we never had to pay attention to before, and all my research shows that basically we aren't doing a very good job of it. Those early inventors, those innovators, had so many good ideas that we've been living off of them ever since, so we haven't had to have any new ideas. Somewhere along the line, we lost that knack of innovation. Somehow we've got to recover it if we're going to thrive and survive in the age of globalization. Now, if you want a definition of globalization, you can Google on it, and there's hundreds of different definitions. But basically, for our purposes, I think we can say that globalization means that we're in a global competition, not just with the South or California anymore, or even with Europe or Japan, but with factory workers in China and office workers in India, and yes, with farmers in Brazil. If the Midwest has been declining for decades, ever since industry started moving to the Sun Belt, well, this business of globalization is really new. China, Russia, and the other former communist countries have joined our economy in maybe the past 25 years. India's been a major player for a little bit more than a decade. All the technology that makes this possible, the internet and the web and Netscape and communication satellites and fiber optics, almost all of this is about the same age as today's college students. Something like 3 billion new workers have joined our economy in the past 2 decades, and they compete with us every day. Now, since most of them came from relatively poor countries, they didn't bring a whole lot of new money with them, which means we have about 3 times as many workers competing for roughly the same amount of money. So no wonder the squeeze is on wages and costs and doing things as cheaply and as efficiently as possible. So what does this mean for the Midwest? I'll try to summarize the effects before getting on to what we can do about it. First, I found that the view from Chicago is deceptive. My city is almost unique in having made the transition from industrial behemoth to global city. Chicago still has its problems, Lord knows, and I'll be coming back to those problems later. But Chicago's vitality and prosperity are the envy of most other Midwestern cities. Some other cities, like Columbus or Indianapolis, which had less of an industrial legacy to overcome, are also doing well. So are a few small cities, some university towns, a handful of small manufacturing towns, some big global companies. But these are the exceptions. The overall pattern for Midwestern cities is pretty dire. Places like Detroit, Cleveland, yes, sometimes St. Louis, impress the visitor as strange, empty places with the highest poverty rates and the highest dropout rates in the nation. Most of them have huge, impoverished inner-city populations. Now, I know this is a sweeping judgment that ignores most of what's good about St. Louis, both the city and the region, much of what makes this city still an exciting place to be. You've got that wonderful research university. You've got globally minded universities like Webster. You've got marvelous parks and a rich architectural heritage. You've got global companies and the Botanical Garden and, of course, this Danforth Center, which would be an enormous asset in any community. And with that, the Bioresearch and Development Growth Park to turn the center's ideas into jobs. At a time when the Philadelphia Orchestra is in bankruptcy, you're supporting still one of the world's great orchestras. And as a Cubs fan, I hate to admit it, but your cards still give us fits, not just last weekend, but year after awful year. Now, these are all civic assets, no question about it. But for whatever reason, they don't add up to the kind of city you want. The latest census figures show that you've lost no less than 2/3 of your peak population, most of it since 1970, and the drain continues, down another 8% in the last decade. So St. Louis has its problems, which is no news to any of you. But one point I want to make is that these problems are shared by a lot of other Midwestern cities. Detroit, of course, is worse off, and so is Cleveland, both in population decline and their prospects for the future. Places like Flint and Gary are going or gone. Of the 8 biggest cities in Ohio, 7 of them have lost 1/3 to 1/2 of their population since their peak. Now, I'm acutely aware that it's very bad form for a guy from Chicago to come in and talk about the problems of other Midwestern cities. So I want to stress that for more reasons than most Chicagoans would like to admit, we share your pain. Much of Chicago is booming. From where I live and work in Chicago, life is great, but which makes me wonder, if we're doing so great, why doesn't it feel any better? The fact is that for all its glitz, Chicago too has lost about 1/4 of its population since its peak. All the heavy industry that made us a city of the big shoulders has mostly gone. We've got a lot of high-priced lawyers and derivatives traders and consultants. We've got some good universities, and we have a batch of good restaurants that serve more than pizza. We're usually ranked in the top 10 global cities for all sorts of reasons. I think you can say that we really are making our way in this globalized world. But still, for all this surface success, Chicago supports 1 million fewer people and hundreds of thousands fewer jobs than it did a half-century ago. About 1/3 of the city is plugged into this global economy and is doing fine. But what about the other 2/3? There's a professor at Ohio State named Rachel Dwyer, and she's done some work that applies to Chicago and to many other Midwestern cities and to the Midwest in general. She's drawn a graph of what she calls the hourglass economy, with quite a lot of good jobs at the top. These are the global citizens, those lawyers, those professors and business types, and a whole lot of bad jobs at the bottom, a lot of them immigrants, the global servants, if you will. The valet parkers and the dog walkers and the dishwashers and those good restaurants, the non-union construction workers, and not much in the middle. There's still a lot of middle-class workers out in this region, but there aren't that many middle-class jobs. Now, this is about half the city of Chicago, living within easy eyesight of the skyscrapers of the Loop, but with no more connection to this global economy than so many Russian peasants. Most live in great poverty. Chicago, like St. Louis or Detroit, is plagued by a school dropout rate of 50% or more. It seems clear that in this new economy, high school dropouts, even high school graduates, need not apply. As President Obama has said, at least 1 or 2 years of post-secondary education is vital. What this means is that we, all of our cities, are turning out a generation of young people who will never hold a decent job as long as they live. All across the Midwest, all across the nation, in fact, we are creating an archipelago of ghettos segregated not only by race, but by employability. An underclass, both black and white, of the unskilled, the uneducated, and the unemployed. Now, this is an economic and a social and a human problem of the first order. It's no recipe for either a strong economy or a strong society. Instead, it's that hourglass society where the global citizens at the top and at the bottom, a majority for whom the global economy is no more than a rumor. So the question we face here in the Midwest is whether there's even a place for our old industrial cities in this new post-industrial economy. And if there is, how do we make room in these cities for all of our citizens? Not just the global elite, which probably includes most of us here in this room this morning, but for those formerly blue-collar workers who found a middle-class way of life in the old economy, who are part of that vanished middle, who've been left behind when that economy went away. The divisions, the disparities in our economy, the gaps between the rich and poor revealed by that hourglass model, all these are very much on people's minds these days. So is the growing partisanship, the growing anger in our society and in our politics. I'd say we're not going to get a social or political resolution of that problem until we figure out a way to make this global economy work for most Americans, for most Midwesterners. But as I said, I've spent a lot of time on the road around the Midwest since my book came out, talking with Midwesterners who see the problems and are thinking hard about how to solve them. One focus, of course, is on education. How to shrink that shameful 50% dropout rate. How to make sure that our kids leave high school with the skills they need for the next stage of their lives. How to strengthen community colleges, which are really on the front lines of this new economy. How to turn our world-class universities like Washington into the global institutions that can really compete in this 21st century. But there's more to this than just what goes on in the classroom. This preparation of the next generation is more than an educational problem. It's a societal problem that needs all of us working together. This means schools and educators working with business and government and economic development specialists. It means working across county lines and state lines, reaching out across the Midwest to leverage this region's very real assets. Because all the education in the world, all the best teachers in the world won't have an impact on their economy all by themselves. Kids aren't dumb. We can tell them that they need an education to get a good job. But if they look out the schoolhouse window and they don't see any good jobs out there, if they don't even know someone who has a good job, they're going to make a rational assessment of the role of higher education in their economic future and go choose a life on the streets. This is a circle, vicious or virtuous depending on how we handle it. We know, we know that without educated citizens, economic vitality doesn't happen. But without economic vitality, education loses much of its meaning. Without a vibrant economy, education cannot achieve one of its goals, which is to lead its graduates to a lifetime of meaningful work. This is important for keeping our best and brightest here in the Midwest, and it's just as important for giving a measure of economic decency to the rest, to give them a life that doesn't require them to work 2 or 3 bad jobs just to stay afloat. St. Louis can't do this on its own. You're part of that Midwestern economy that rose together through much of the last century, that's been declining together for the past 30 or 40 years, and will recover only if the entire region recovers. So what do we have to do then, as cities and as a region, to revitalize our economy and our education? Well, first, I'd say that we all have a huge educational job ahead just to convince Midwesterners that the old industrial economy is gone. That it's not their granddaddy's economy anymore. The manufacturing still may be strong, but not as a major source of jobs. We have to convince people that they live in a global economy now, that they're locked in global competition, that they're competing not just with Illinois or Iowa, but with people on the other side of the world, and they need global skills and global knowledge to do this. The Midwest needs a huge wake-up call. There's a lot of denial out there, and it's up to all of us to deliver that wake-up call, to deliver that education and the way the real world works. Business has a big role to play here. This is tricky. Businesses traditionally hate to get involved in politics, and education policy can get very political. Similarly, schools often worry that close ties with corporations taint the educational mission somehow, take the academy away from its proper focus on the life of the mind. I think this is unrealistic in this current environment. First, as you all know, state support for higher education is shrinking throughout the Midwest as a percentage of total costs, if not in absolute terms. Colleges and universities can raise tuition costs, and they are, but much of the real funding for higher education in the future is going to come from contracts with corporations. Second, it's business that is going to be employing the graduates of the schools. One problem with our schools is that they are too often divorced from the economy around, not teaching the students what they need to know to compete in a global economy. Now, I'm talking mostly about high schools here. Community colleges do a good job of this, but I think high school should do the same. I'm constantly amazed that in most towns and cities, schools think they've done all they need to do for economic development by handing out diplomas, while business people feel they've done all they need to do for education by paying taxes. In most places, the two seldom talk with each other. I'd love to see schools working harder to find out from businesses what skills and knowledge the employees of the future need, and I'd love to see businesses demanding that schools turn out the kind of employees they need. If this happens, I'll bet you'd be getting young high school graduates who are much more prepared to join the world of work and who have a much clearer idea what that world looks like. Beyond that, I hope the Midwest will take a regional approach to these issues. It's possible, I guess, that St. Louis and its region could exist as an island of prosperity in the Midwest afflicted by economic decline, but I wouldn't bet on it. In doing my research, I was astounded at how balkanized this Midwest is, how little we know about each other, how afraid we are even to think about cooperating with each other. Everywhere I went, I met people in government, in business, and academia who were true experts on their own backyards, who knew everything there was to know about their own cities or states, but had literally no idea what was going on next door across the state line or the town line. All thinking and all policy in the Midwest needs to be locked up within state lines. The thinking dominated by the big state universities, the policy, including economic and educational policy, dominated by the state governments, dictated by each state and confined to that state. Each state has its own science policy, its own venture capital fund, its own educational bureaucracy, even its own offices in places like Shanghai and Brussels. But globalization couldn't care less about state lines drawn 2 centuries ago. States like Missouri and Kansas, or Illinois and Wisconsin, are making fools of themselves, competing with each other, trying to steal businesses from each other, when the real competition is 10,000 miles away on the other side of the world and they're eating our lunch. It's time for the Midwest to meet the challenges as a region, leveraging its many strengths. This means our research universities, like Washington, working together with other universities on research that affects the entire region. New forms of manufacturing, for instance, or certainly bio, which is one of our big strengths. It means a Midwestern venture capital fund, which would turn this research into companies and jobs. Like most Midwestern cities, you graduate thousands of well-educated kids every year, and far too many leave town to seek jobs somewhere else. What sort of venture capital, what sort of business services and help could persuade those bright young people to stay here and prosper? Tom Friedman had a good column about a company here called EndoStim, inspired by immigrants but funded by local venture capitalists. Well, that sounds like you're doing something right, and the rest of the Midwest should be paying attention. Grabbing the future means a Midwestern educational effort to convince kids and their parents that they better stay in school. It means looking across state lines to see what other states are doing in these areas, to see if there just might be some good ideas out there that we haven't tried yet. In general, it means hard work across state lines to create a vibrant Midwest economy so our kids don't have to go to California or the Sun Belt to put their education to use. Personally, I hope it also means a true high-speed rail network that would really tie this region together. As I mentioned at the start, there are a lot of people in the Midwest who see the challenge and are thinking hard about how to meet it. I'd like to report that most of them are thinking regionally, across state lines, or putting old jurisdictional rivalries behind them. But alas, that's not happening yet. My own region, the Chicago Economic Region is actually a 4-state region running from Milwaukee down through Chicago, through northern Indiana, and up into western Michigan, which would be a true powerhouse if we could put it all together. But we seem unable to join hands across those state lines, and so we remain so much less than the sum of our parts. In one sense, St. Louis itself, your urban region, is a pretty balkanized place. But I'm told that in another sense, you're doing it right here, looking across the river to your hinterland in Illinois, paying much more attention to this fertile backyard than you do to Jefferson City. This just strikes me as common sense. Finally, as I said, we need to recover that knack of innovation. This region was built on manufacturing, but we can't pretend that manufacturing is going to provide the jobs for all the young people who need them. Indeed, instead, we have to get a piece of the industries of the future. Obviously, this includes bioscience and biotech, which is what this center is all about. You know a lot more about what's going on here and where you want to go than I do. But there are two things about the Danforth Center that I find particularly instructive for the rest of the Midwest. First, it isn't trying to create a whole new industry from scratch, but it's building on existing strengths, on the research capabilities of the university and of companies like Monsanto. Much of the industry that created the Midwest, the auto industry and other heavy manufacturing, is going or gone. It's not coming back. But we still know how to make things. We still have terrific universities. We have companies with deep reserves of expertise. These are relics of our past, if you will, but we can build on them to create the future, which is pretty much what you're doing here. The second thing is the role of philanthropy in creating our economy. Around the Midwest, when you find something interesting going on, quite often the catalysts are wealthy local families focusing their philanthropy on one industry or another. The Stowers are doing this in Kansas City. The two families who founded Amway have endowed a real base of medical research in Grand Rapids, Michigan. This center, obviously, wouldn't exist without the Danforths. Wealthy families, often older wealthy families, exist in every Midwestern city, and I'd like to see them use their wealth in a focused way, as the Danforths have, to revitalize their cities. Even then, this global future remains uncharted territory. Pretty scary place for the old cities in the Midwest. As I mentioned, Chicago has definitely turned the corner into the global economy and still can't provide the jobs, income for all its citizens the way the old industrial economy did. Perhaps our old Midwestern cities are a relic of the past. Perhaps they existed for only one season, to lead the nation into the industrial age and to be left behind when that age ended. Perhaps the concept of a shrinking city applies not only to Flint or Youngstown, but to all of us. But I'm not ready to throw in the towel yet. Over the past 150 years, we've created a vibrant Midwestern civilization, not just an economy, but a civilization that enriched millions of lives and could still do so in the future. We're not just going through a recession now, not just a short-term economic crisis. We face a long-term challenge to take ourselves out of an industrial era that is past and to prepare ourselves for a global era that is already here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Richard. Richard, thank you so much. It was insightful, interesting, and alarming at the same time, just as we hope. Today we are joined on the stage by some people, like many of the people in this room, who have dedicated their time, their talents, and their treasures to trying to solve and address some of these issues and opportunities that exist here in our wonderful city of St. Louis. And so I'm just going to try to keep this thing moving and touch on some of the things that were written in the book, but people up here who had different pieces of experience with revitalizing the city. The first is Derek Rapp, who many of you all know is an example of somebody who took an extraordinary idea and turned it into a commercial vehicle. One of the things that Richard talks about in the book, Derek, is the challenges, and specifically identifies St. Louis as how do they come from the unbelievable research opportunities into commercialization vehicles, and what role venture capital plays in that, and we'd love to hear from you on how that impacted the company as well as what you see in the future.
Certainly. So the company to which Jack was referring is Divergence, and Divergence, to jump to the end, was acquired by Monsanto just about 3 months ago. Divergence was the brainchild of a scientist at the Washington University Genome Sequencing Center. In fact, the company's first employees were almost entirely from either WashU or Monsanto. In many ways, I think the company became sort of a microcosm of what we're trying to do in this region in life sciences. Our first funders were from Midwest, both Chicago and St. Louis, angel investors. Our first venture capital money was from Prolog Ventures right here in town, and then follow-on financing from Midpoint Food and Ag out of Indianapolis. Richard, you mentioned the idea of funds focused on the Midwest, and certainly there are some VCs, venture capitalists, who are trying to do just that. And Jack, you mentioned the fact that there's the challenge of how you take the great research that exists in this region. Richard, in your book, you talk about Stanford and MIT as being two examples of universities that have done a great job of converting the research engines that exist in those universities and turning it into a lot of companies and success stories, obviously, for the regions, and really to build a culture, I would say, in each of those regions, even with Route 128 in Silicon Valley. Those are, I would point out, about the only two universities in the country that are really cited that way as being consistent stars when it comes to cultivating companies from the research. That is a fantastic opportunity. It's also a challenge here, but we do have obviously great resources in this region. Washington University is, I believe, still the second leading recipient of funds from NIH and NSF. Obviously, we're talking primarily about the med school. And we also have UMSL and SLU that are excellent research institutions in their own right. And then you add to that the companies, the anchor institutions that exist with Monsanto, and here with Danforth Plant Science Center, and the activities of Sigma Aldrich and Pfizer and others. We do have a lot of the basic ingredients, and what we need to do is to continue to see people with the ideas turn them into companies, and then a lot of the infrastructure exists to take them forward, as evidenced by what happened with Divergence.
Thank you, Derek. Next, Denny Coleman, who is the Economic Development Director for the St. Louis County and has been involved in this and is actually cited in the book for the work that he's done. Denny, I thought it might be interesting. You have seen the challenges and the opportunities, and one of the things Richard talks about is viewing this as a region, not only not a state line, but in our case in St. Louis, a city-county line. We'd love to hear from you as you look about doing your job, which is absolutely critical to the future of the region. The politics that exist as a result of that are challenging. How have you addressed those on a daily basis, and how do you see the region going forward, working together as a team to attract companies, jobs, and the things we need to make it a great region?
Well, I started this job with a full head of hair. No, but seriously, there are challenges when you have 92 municipalities just within St. Louis County, and a third of the county isn't even incorporated. So we've got lots of opportunities for the balkanization challenges that Richard talked about, much less the city-county lines, the Missouri-Illinois lines, and so on. I think you have to overcome it in a couple of ways. People get outside of their silos, in my experience, for one of two reasons. Either because they see terrific challenges that can only be met by looking beyond their own borders, or they see such substantial opportunities that they want to jump on those opportunities. They have to do it together. I think that the element of leadership is also absolutely vital. For good reason, Richard and Derek mentioned the great work that's done here at the Danforth Plant Science Center. That doesn't come about unless you have a leader like Bill Danforth, who's willing to put his time, his influence, his treasure, and tremendous amount of energy behind it. The gentleman to my left does the same thing in a number of ways. And so we have great leaders who understand that the economy does not respect the political boundaries, who are willing to step forward and take leadership roles in moving us all forward. We also have to have collaboration and cooperation among and between the economic development organizations, and that's only possible if we have, particularly in our case, a mayor and a county executive in Francis Slay and Charlie Dooley, who, although they're elected by their own constituents in their respective political jurisdictions, understand the greater good. And that allows us to collaborate and cooperate on a number of different initiatives, like the initiative to create a China cargo hub here, which has been done across political jurisdictions. It's been city, county, it's been Democrat, Republican, it's been business and public. The World Trade Center director, Tim Nowak, is here. The World Trade Center itself is a city-county appointed board of directors. So we have taken things like globalization seriously for some time and have generated the kind of structure and the kind of initiative that is looking toward the 21st century, China as a growth opportunity, but also linking China and South America through a cargo hub here through St. Louis, which I think is going to happen. Tim, right? It's going to happen soon. These kinds of initiatives have to be done, they have to be planned, they have to be done with vision, they have to be done with a lot of work, and people looking beyond their own boundaries. And one final thing I would say, that the initiative that was undertaken to collaborate on an I-6 challenge grant was very important for this region, talking about taking science out of institutions and commercializing that for job opportunities of the future. We were only 6 regions in the country that were awarded this I-6 challenge grant, and only came about, we've got the great science, but because of the collaborative spirit of the city and the county and Washington U and St. Louis U and the biogenerator and the Danforth Center and the Plant Life Sciences Coalition all coming together to jointly apply for this was truly remarkable. It's been noted nationally that we came together as a region. That really portends for great things for the future.
Benny, thank you for that. Then our next speaker needs no introduction, except to say that John gave a speech about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, that really answered an underlying murmur that existed, which was we were losing all these company headquarters, and let's wring our hands or go home and get in the fetal position and give up. John gave a forceful speech that was turned into an op-ed, which really gave the truth to the story. And interestingly enough, in the book, one of the things you cite, Richard, was the move in Chicago to get Boeing to come back from Seattle. And while that was a great signal, it didn't mean that much in terms of actual jobs in Chicago because of the global nature of these companies on a global basis, and really the economic model being the mechanism for where things are done. That being said, John, you've been a leader in this. You've been a leader here in the Plant Science Center. You are one of the people that make all this happen. Give us your vision of how we can all work together to continue to grow that piece.
Okay. Let me first comment on that, on the Boeing situation. And I agree with what Richard said in terms of Chicago having turned themselves into a global city. When Boeing was looking at moving the headquarters, they considered 3 cities: Chicago, Dallas, and Denver, because those were cities that were all reasonably centrally located in terms of facilities and that. But in the end, Chicago was the clear favorite because it was a global city, much more than either of the other two. And so that's why they picked Chicago. On the other hand, when you look at it from an overall economic development point of view, Chicago now has about 500 Boeing employees, all office workers. St. Louis still has 15,000, 4,000 of whom are engineers. And it has the headquarters of the Boeing Defense, Space, and Security Group. So and this is, by the way, the number of employees that were here 15 years ago at McDonnell Douglas. So it has maintained that employment level with very high-skilled, very, very high-trained employment. So part of my argument on we shouldn't be wringing our hands over losing headquarters is that you got to look and see what happened after that. Look at Monsanto. We lost the Monsanto headquarters here. Well, now we have a spin-off from the old Monsanto, still called Monsanto, but it's got a market value multiple times as high as the old Monsanto ever had. And it's in a business that is it's the leader in a business that is a growing, business of the future, whereas old Monsanto tended to be in business that was consolidating. It was in chemicals, and so the new Monsanto here has a tremendous more future than the old one. And so when part of my thesis was we shouldn't be worrying about losing headquarters. I mean, if you look at the list of companies since the mid-'90s that have moved or lost their headquarters from here, I mean, it's a long list. In fact, all the Fortune 500 companies that were headquartered in St. Louis in the mid-'90s, except for one, are either no longer around or have moved the headquarters. That one is Emerson. But all the others have moved, but it doesn't mean that St. Louis has lost out in terms of the overall economic impact. Furthermore, it's not that companies are moving or losing or consolidating, because that happens in business. I mean, that's the business cycle. You go from a growth business to a mature business and then a consolidating business, and that goes on. The important thing is, are there companies coming along that are going to take the place of the old ones? And there I would say it's a resounding yes here in St. Louis. We've got companies here now that 20 years ago weren't on the map. Look at Enterprise Rent-A-Car. I mean, there is the leading company in a worldwide business, and 20 years ago it was a small company. Look at Express Scripts. Right. Look at Peabody Energy. I mean, there's a whole raft of companies that have taken the places of the companies that have declined or at least partially moved away. So I see us being in a really good part of the cycle now. In a sense, we had a curse in the 60s through 90s. We had about 6 or 7 companies that year after year, decade after decade, were in the Fortune 500, and they were very stable, civic leader companies. And as a result, I think St. Louis was complacent. And furthermore, I think it depressed entrepreneurial activities, because who needed it? I mean, these companies, they weren't interested in entrepreneurial. They were growing their business worldwide. Now that we've lost some of those headquarters, there is a real entrepreneurial spirit that's grown around here. And I think you can't have both. And frankly, I would rather be us in the phase of having this bubbling entrepreneurial spirit that's going on, because that means 25 years from now, we're going to have a number of large, successful corporations here in St. Louis that hadn't existed prior to that. So I'm very optimistic.
Thank you. We've got some questions from the audience that we want to put out to the panel. The first one is, and Richard, I'll give this to you. What are the region's biggest obstacles to success in globalization?
One thing I think is something that John, you just alluded to. We are still holding on to the past with both hands. Chicago benefited from the fact that almost everything that made us this big industrial city went away in the 70s and 80s. And it was either reinvent ourselves or just slowly slide into Lake Michigan. You say St. Louis, because of the strength of old companies, got complacent back up until the 90s. You still see this in Detroit. They're still making some cars there, so they're holding on to that old industry with both hands. Sometimes you just got to let go of the past, and then you build on the past. You take the expertise that you have, as you're doing here with bioscience, and building something new. The second thing, I think, is this question of balkanization. Honestly, you're not competing with Illinois anymore. We should be treating this place as a region all over the world, from Europe to China, to India. Regions are coming together across provincial and state and city lines to leverage their strengths. That's what we got to do here. We've got so much going for us here in the Midwest if we ever put it together, but we never do put it together. The third thing I think is really doing something, Derek, about this business of venture capital. What you're doing here is fine. The fact remains we get something like 22% I think it is of all NIH grants here in the Midwest, which is probably about our share. We have about 4% of the nation's venture capital pool, which means that most of these good ideas that spin off these grants have to go somewhere else to be exploited. Setting up local venture capital pools is absolutely vital. I like to see a Midwestern venture capital pool. Most of your state venture capital pools, those things that kind of spun off the tobacco money, are very highly politicized, and for that reason, have to produce jobs immediately within this governor's term. They can't really. they can't build for the future. We put out a paper done by Frank Samuels, who used to run the Third Frontier Fund in Ohio, calling for a Midwestern venture capital fund that would be put together by governments and industries and philanthropists, but would be used across the Midwest, not to invest in companies, but to invest in the existing venture capital firms, just to enable them to do more work, to do more investing, to really zero in on the good ideas that spin off your universities, and yes, off your community colleges too, so they can grow here.
Can I comment on that too? I would argue that probably even more important than venture capital is to have entrepreneurs, because what we have found in the last 10 years is the venture capital will follow the entrepreneur. If you've got an entrepreneur that is trusted by venture capitalists, they'll allow that company to stay where the entrepreneur is, because that's where the entrepreneur is willing to be. Now, to an extent, they go together, because venture capitalists kind of get stables of entrepreneurs, and when they come up with a good idea, they basically try to insert their own entrepreneur. But one of the things we're working on very hard now is to increase the stable of what we'd call serial entrepreneurs here in the St. Louis region. This is an entrepreneur that takes a company, makes it successful to a certain stage, turns it over to professional management, recycles back, starts another company. And what we're trying to do here now is to get these serial entrepreneurs going. Not to downgrade the importance of venture capital, because that's something we've been working on hard too. But without the entrepreneurs, even if you have the venture capital, it's going to be hard to keep the companies.
But look for venture capitalists look for entrepreneurs everywhere. Yeah. Not only people who are already in it, but community colleges have a lot of bright kids who've never been encouraged to go out into business on their own. Work with them there. Work with high school kids. Teach entrepreneurship in high schools. I think you're like most cities. You've probably got an awful lot of empty, vacant stores that are probably even dropped off the tax rolls. Give them to kids. Give them to schools, and let kids start businesses in there just to get some experience. Most of them will fail. That's all right. They get the idea.
Moving into kind of a different question, a different direction from the audience. And you point this out in the book, and you talk about the donut effect in a lot of these Midwest cities. To what extent is sprawl limiting the viable options for revitalization of these downtown cores?
To a great degree. The question is, can you have strong suburban area without a vital city center? And the answer, of course, is yes. Most Midwestern cities do have that. But I still think that in this day and age, when most of the world is coming together into cities, where cities are the place to be, that having a strong, vital, active core center of your city is really important. And the places are sprawling out. Even places like Indianapolis and Columbus that are growing in population are also growing in area, so there really isn't more concentration. Getting people together in one place downtown, getting them to have lunch together, just to bounce ideas off of each other. One smart person meeting face to face with another smart person is where the action is.
One of the topics in the book, Richard, that you spend time around, which I think is really focused and insightful as it relates to Missouri, is the what's happened when you have state capitals in parts of the state that are not the vital business vibrancy, and the impact of that, in addition to the kind of rural versus urban politics, and what you said earlier is globalization being an issue that divides those two things. I know here in Missouri we feel this a lot because we have this this mantra in Jefferson City. Well, you know, I can run against St. Louis and it's going to get me votes wherever I have. The business leadership has really tried to, RCGA, our Regional Business Council, and others have tried to work very hard, as well as the Danforth Plant Science Center, in bringing the rural legislatures, who in many cases have a lot more power than the people in the city, to understand the impact it has on their individual communities. I'd be interested, and one of the questions we have is, how is Chicago, which faces that same challenge with the downstate legislature in Springfield and the anti-Chicago, how have they been able to overcome that in dealing with the globalization of their city in a state that is really a lot more rural when you take Chicago out?
Honest government.
You got it. Chicago has overcome this through the strength of its universities, because of O'Hare and its places of transport hub, just the sheer size of the place, et cetera, et cetera. But we are running up against real limits to that. We suffer from our connection, as it were, with Springfield. We, like most cities in the Midwest, like St. Louis, like every place I know, still looks to the state capital and the state government as the source of all permission, of all ideas, and of all funding. And as you know, with state government, certainly in Illinois, that money isn't there, the ideas aren't there. I think we really have to break ourselves free from this. We're not, the federal system is here to stay. We are not going to get rid of state governments, but they have, for our future here in the cities, they have to become less important. We have to be able to recover some of the permission on taxation, on zoning, on infrastructure that we traditionally have looked to state governments for. We, more than anything else, have to figure out how to fund ourselves. This business of building a global city is expensive stuff. And we are really up against it in Chicago with a huge civic deficit, with schools that need a lot of money, with infrastructure that is crumbling. We need to spend a whole lot of money just to keep ourselves as a global city. You need to spend a whole lot of money to revitalize St. Louis, and the money isn't there. So I think one of the big questions of the future, a real academic study, if you will, is how are the cities of the future going to finance themselves, going to pay for themselves, to be able to afford this global future. Now, one way is to revitalize your center, to bring more and more people down there. These are quite often people who can afford to live anywhere, and we're glad to have them. We also tend to raise the prices. How do you do this financing? Taxation, fees, user fees, that sort of thing, without pricing out of the city most of the people who already live there. Now, that's the question. I don't know of nobody who has the answer, but it's an answer we've got to find.
I'll just add that, in at least small companies, the old adage is always that the companies have the easiest time raising money when they already have money. Mm-hmm. And somewhat analogously, I think for cities, for St. Louis, if we're going to talk about St. Louis right now, I think for us to make our case so compelling that therefore the folks outstate, as we say here, view it as obvious that St. Louis benefits the whole state. I've been to Jeff City a number of times to talk about different legislations, particularly associated with biotechnology and life sciences, and pretty consistently the reaction I get from outstate congressmen or representatives or senators is that's about St. Louis and Kansas City and not about the rest of us. And we need to help them see that it is obviously about the whole area and not just about our specific little metropolitan areas.
To a degree. I think this is a hard sell telling people in Carbondale that Chicago benefits them very much. Mostly what we do is take their best, their smartest kids and bring them up Chicago and put them to work, leaving less back there. We take the money out. Places, the Midwest, everywhere, is focusing in on cities where the action is. I'm not sure you can make the argument that cities benefit the entire region the way they did in the industrial era. This is a hard sell, and what I'm arguing is that cities like Chicago and St. Louis may have to really look out for number one here.
I would say, as far as your example of Carbondale, for example, who is more apt to live in Carbondale someday, who is a highly educated, globally sophisticated individual? I think it's the person who grew up in Carbondale. And so therefore, I mean, I'm agreeing with you to an extent, but for those people to have the opportunity to be in Chicago and then someday perhaps to return to Carbondale, or to have business opportunities even early on in Carbondale, I think still the tide is raised somewhat by what happens in Chicago, even for Carbondale.
I think one of the additional problems that we have here in the state of Missouri is term limits. About the time you get the legislators educated, you understand the importance of the major urban areas to the state's economy, the things that are going on here that can help the rural areas as well. Those legislators are out the door, or they're looking for their next job. It's a real problem to have that constant turnover of leadership in our state, along with all the other problems that Richard's identified in his book.
Yeah, we have mayors for life. Solves it.
Well, your new one clearly is more colorful than the last, at least as it relates to his language. Good question from the audience. Where is the public education system working to prepare our next generation of leadership for the global environment, and why does it work there?
You're asking me.
You're singing for your supper.
In places where they see jobs. There's a little town up in northern Indiana, you probably heard of it, Warsaw, which is the orthopedics capital of the world. 3 of the 4 biggest orthopedics companies in the United States are headquartered in Warsaw. You ever get an artificial knee, an artificial hip, probably comes from Warsaw. It's a county of about 70,000 people, and there's no less than 7,000 direct jobs and about 14,000 indirect jobs spinning off these companies. These companies work very closely with the local community college, Ivy Tech, and with the high schools, bring kids in, give them internships, train them. Kids coming out of those schools know, if they want to go off to the Ivy League or the Indiana University and make their way in the world, fine. But if they want to stay home, they pretty much know they've got a job there with Biotech, Biomed, or Dupuy, or one of these companies. I just got back from China with a delegation from the Illinois Central College in Peoria, Illinois. That's a community college. Now, when I grew up, community college was a couple cinder block buildings on the edge of town. This is a place with about 30,000 students. They have connections with 2 Chinese universities. They send students every year on extended 3-month programs to China to learn about Chinese business and learn Mandarin. As with most community colleges, these are the first kids in their families, most of them ever to go to college. They are probably not going to be CEOs of their companies. We're not talking Harvard Business School here. But they are going to come out of there, they're going to stay in Peoria, they're going to get mid-level management jobs in companies in Peoria, and they really know what the global economy looks like. That's the sort of thing.
And of course, our community college has a presence here at Bridge Park, training biotechnicians for jobs in the plant life sciences, which is a great partnership.
And my understanding is last class, all of them got jobs.
Divergence hired a number of them while they were still in school. In fact, they would take classes and then come right upstairs to us. So, yeah, and I think here in the center too. So it makes great sense.
Last topic, last question, because we want to keep on the schedule. The Midwest, as we know, was settled by immigrants, and as you cite in the book, Chicago currently has over 20% of foreign-born population in the city, and when you contrast that to the coast, it's less, San Francisco and New York being in the 30s. But when you contrast that to Missouri or St. Louis being 3%, What does that mean, and how do we as a city do a better job of attracting that talent pool to St. Louis?
This is a judgment on the city. Immigrants are both a cause and effect of economic vitality. They're an effect. People see that there's jobs. People see that there's something going on in the city, and they all flock there. And once they get there, they phone home and they say, hey, there are good jobs here. You all come. In other words, it's a validation of what's going on. If you don't have a lot of immigrants, it's probably a negative validation because the buzz isn't out there. Immigrants will only come if there are jobs. The effect is to create jobs. My son lives in Toronto. Go up there, and it's like being in the United Nations. That place is 50% foreign born. Got everybody. But they really try to draw in people with money or with education. It's having an impact on their economy. And that's great stuff. In Chicago, a lot of our immigrants, we've got 1.5 million Hispanic immigrants. About half of them, I think, are probably illegal or undocumented, if they will. Still, they come, they take jobs, they create jobs, they open stores, they even buy property, they open restaurants, spins and spins and spins, because even at that level, a lot of them grade school dropouts, they're still contributing to the economy. Number one shopping street in Chicago is still, of course, Michigan Avenue. Number two shopping street is 22nd Street, running right down the middle of the Hispanic neighborhood.
Yeah, you cited 14,000 business owned, 24,000 employees from those 14,000 businesses, a $2.4 billion per year impact on Chicago from that Hispanic population.
What we're working on now is trying to talk them into investing more of that money in Chicago and sending less back to Mexico as remittances. Mm-hmm. And that's not only us. This is the Mexican community is trying to do the same thing.
Well, as you can see, we could be here for the next 2 hours, and really unbelievable thanks to our panel, each of whom has added significant insight and impact on what's happening in St. Louis. And of course, Richard, to you, I want to thank you on behalf of all of us for causing us to question and encouraging us to work together as we attempt to impact this great place, the Midwest, which is not only such an important part of the past, but an important part of the future. With that, we're excited to have our future, who is embodied in our new president here, Jim Carrington, to close.
All right, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for getting up very early to come this morning. This is a great crowd, and a truly fantastic program. Thank you for being here. I want to thank the Leadership Council, Jim Johnson, Jack Oliver, and all of the others. This is a great group. This is a vibrant group. They meet frequently at 7:15. This is their normal time slot, and it's the best thing I get up really, really early in the morning for. I want to thank Richard Longworth. Thank you for coming down from Chicago. Fantastic. I think, I'm guessing most of the audience here, or at least the sizable proportion, has read your book. I would encourage you to read his blog. If you thought the book was ringing the alarm bell, the blog, you bring the bigger hammer out on your blog. And I want to thank the panel. This is the very best that St. Louis and the region has to offer sitting up here. Thanks for doing this. And some of the group will be heard on KWMU at 11 o'clock this morning as a follow-up to this program. Now, just a few closing thoughts, and I want to, when I have a chance to give my thoughts in a group like this, what could I possibly say? So I sit here for an hour and try to think of something contrarian and interesting to say that will follow on. And I'm not sure there's much contrarian I can say to what's already been said, except let me do this. Let me shine the light on the Danforth Center and ask, how do we as an organization deal with what we've heard today I've been thinking about this, not necessarily specifically in the context of globalization, but in the context of how do we compete as a scientific center. And a lot of the principles that we've heard about competing on a global level apply very directly to the long-term viability of the Danforth Center. I'm going to say one thing that's contrarian. You heard about how great the Danforth Center is today. And it is a great institution. It's a young institution, and it's something we should be proud of. But I'll tell you, the more everyone talks about how great it is, the more concerned I get, because the big enemy of our success here long-term is not competition. It's not Chinese scientists or Brazilian scientists. It's complacency. So I've got to be careful to take the compliments about the center too carefully. Richard made, I don't know if this was your exact comment, but I wrote it down within 5 minutes of your presentation, and it's really what we have to do as a center to be more relevant and to have a stronger future. We have to redefine, reinvent, and retool. So in the context, again, of the Danforth Center, what does that mean? We have to redefine how we think of ourselves and what our role is. We have a mission that's impeccable, but how do we define ourselves as an institution? We have to define it a little differently than we used to. Rather than looking to Washington to set our research agenda through funding mechanisms, which is the conventional way of thinking about what do you do research on? Well, it's what you people will give you money to do. That's absolutely the wrong way to think about it. We have to redefine ourselves as the group that defines what the agenda is, and Washington and the state, and indeed the companies, need to follow on. And if we're credible, we can define the agenda. This is absolutely critical. We need to reinvent ourselves. We heard a lot about regional cooperation. This applies to the Danforth Center as well. We're not in isolation here. We need to reinvent ourselves not just as a better research institution. We need to reinvent ourselves as a center for education and training as well. No, we don't grant degrees, but we do education and training every day, and we need to do it a whole lot better because we can't count on the universities training where the need is as it relates to what the Danforth Center does. And finally, we have to retool. For those of you who have been around the Danforth Center the past 6 months or so, which is most of you, you know that we're undergoing a retooling. This involves retooling in situ here, bringing and repositioning technology in the center. But it also means retooling with people that we're going out and drawing to the center. And indeed, there's some retooling that's happening among the existing groups in the Danforth Center as well. So with that, I'm going to close this fascinating event, and thank you again for coming, and have a good day.